Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the first of very many videos on Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. As you probably know by now, because I talk about it all the time, I'm currently hosting a Charles Dickens read-along, a Victorian-style serialised read-along of Our Mutual Friend. So every month we are reading a couple of chapters of this glorious, glorious book. What we are doing is reading a few chapters every month, the few chapters that the Victorians would have read when they read Our Mutual Friend. Back in the Victorian period, a lot of novels were not published in one volume, but they were published serially, so Our Mutual Friend was published from May 1864 until November 1865. It was published 4 chapters the first month, 3 chapters the second, etc, etc. So I know many of you have also read this month the first 4 chapters of Our Mutual Friend, and I know a lot of you have enjoyed it, even if some of you found the second chapter quite tricky, but I will talk about that more in a minute. So today I'm here to talk about the first 4 chapters of Our Mutual Friend. If you haven't yet read the first 4 chapters of Our Mutual Friend, obviously there will be spoilers for those 4 chapters, but there will be no spoilers for stuff that happens later in the book, if that makes sense. Right, let's talk about Our Mutual Friend. So, this month for the read-along, we read the first 4 chapters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through these 4 chapters and what happens in them, stuff I think is of interest in them. So, right. Chapter 1. So in the first chapter of Our Mutual Friend, the book opens very dramatically, I think, and in a really, really powerful way. It is my favourite opening in a Dickens novel. I think it is so atmospheric because you have this river at night, you have 2 people on a boat, you have Lizzie Hexam and her father, Gaffer Hexam. They're rowing on a boat and they have with them something they are pulling along beside the boat, which by the end of the chapter it becomes kind of clear is a dead man, and it also becomes clear that as well as dragging this corpse along through the River Thames, that Gaffer Hexam has also taken some money. There's a moment where he leans out the boat and he comes back with his hand full of money, and you realise that he has taken money from the corpse. Also in this chapter we're introduced to another man who also rows past on his boat. This man used to be a sort of business partner of Gaffer Hexam's, but at this stage he is no longer. He's been in prison for a while for robbing a live man. Gaffer and this other man have a conversation about whether or not you can rob the dead. There is this idea that Gaffer Hexam firmly believes that you cannot rob the dead because money does not belong to the world of the dead. Money belongs to this world. So if you take money from a corpse, that's morally fine. If you take money from a living man, that's not okay, but you can take as much money as you want from a dead man. You know, this opening chapter really sets up the 2, I would say, the 2 key themes in Our Mutual Friends, which are death and money. And we also have in this chapter the introduction of Lizzie. Now, I like Lizzie a lot. Lizzie Hexam is one of my favourite literary characters ever. I did my undergrad dissertation on how the presentation of gender changes in Charles Dickens's novels over time, and my dissertation, although I talked about 7 books, it was at least a third Our Mutual Friend, and about half of that was talking about how wonderful Lizzie Hexam is. So anyway, one of the things that I think is really fascinating about Lizzie Hexam is that she's immediately set up as being quite different from other Dickensian heroines, and one of the key things we get in this first chapter is a sense of her physical strength. She and her father are in a boat. Her father is not rowing, she is the one rowing, and it's said that she rows very easily, and it's said that after the conversation between Gaffer Hexam and his old business partner, her and her father move off really fast, and she is clearly very physically strong. And this is massively important because previously most of Charles Dickens's heroines are physically weak. If you think about characters like Essa Summerson, Little Dorrit, Florence Dombey, Lucy Manette, these characters have emotional strength, but none of them have physical strength. None of them are ever shown to be physically strong, and they are often shown to be physically weak. But Lizzie Hexam is not, and this is very important, not only in terms of presentation of gender roles, but also going forward in the novel and the kind of certain power that could give her to a certain extent, the fact that she is physically strong. So we have all of these exciting things going on in the first chapter. We have already this sense of mystery, of dread, of doom. We have these 2 people in a boat hauling along a corpse through the River Thames. It is so dark and so powerful. Oh, it's brilliant. I love this book so much. You know, there's always a bit of me that wonders before I start rereading a book that I love, if I will love it as much rereading it, or if my love for the book has kind of become separate to the book to the point that when I read the book it won't be the thing I love because the thing I love is not quite that book. And yet, rereading the first 4 chapters of Our Mutual Friend, I was just like, yeah, this is the best book ever. I love this book so much. I can't get enough of this book. Anyway, moving on. Chapter 2. Now, what I have gathered from Twitter and from the Goodreads group is that most people loved the first chapter and then found the second chapter very, very difficult. There are a lot of characters in the second chapter. Dickens throws this massive society dinner party at you in which there are a lot of characters and a lot of very complicated language and a lot of very Victorian references. We have this dinner party scene, we're introduced to the Veneerings, this brand new couple who are clearly very sociable, very high in society, they have a lot of money and everything is new and sparkling and kind of false, and they have this friend, Mr. Tremolo, who has known them not very long but seems to be their oldest friend, but he can't quite work out if he is their oldest friends because they're so chummy with everyone. They act with everyone like they've known them for a really long time. It is a kind of pretense that the Veneerings have been in society for a very, very long time, where actually it is implied that their money is quite new and they have not been in society for a very long time. I think this is really the significance of Mr. Tremolo's concern about whether he is an old friend of the Veneerings or a new friend of the Veneerings. I think it comes down to this idea of new money, and the Veneerings aims to pretend that they have been in society for a really long time when in fact they haven't. At this dinner party we are also introduced to the fabulous Lady Tippings, and Lady Tippings is a slightly older woman and she claims that she has a notebook she carries around with her with lists of all her lovers, of all the men that love her, and she crosses people out when they do things that she doesn't approve of. So she's quite an entertaining comical character, and again comes across as very false, like she's putting on this act. And in chapter 2 we're also introduced to two very, very important characters, Mortimer Lightwood and Eugene Wrayburn, and it is through the discussions of these characters that the big kind of plot point, the big drama opening of the novel is revealed. There is this old man, Mr. Harmon, who has left a massive fortune behind him on his death because he made his money through dust, through collecting rubbish, sorting through it and making money out of it. And that is a fascinating theme, the idea of making money from nothing, of the connection between money and dust and rubbish and worthlessness is so important in this book, and I love the fact that it begins with this massive fortune that has been made from collecting rubbish. That's wonderful. And it's revealed that this man, old Mr. Harmon, has not been very kind to his family, but he does have one son who has survived him and his fortune is going to his son. Mortimer Lightwood is telling the company, the society dinner party, about the fact that this man is coming back to claim his fortune, but young Mr. Harmon is only allowed to claim this fortune if he marries a particular woman. And then at the very end of the chapter, in a massive twist of events, Mortimer Lightwood is brought in a note to tell him that the man, young Mr. Harmon, has been found drowned. And I love that as a setup for the novel, because I love that Dickens gives you this really fascinating, really dramatic, complex plot. He tells you about this will, this man coming back to claim it, who is going to be forced to marry this woman he doesn't know, and then Dickens completely turns this on his head by revealing that the man has died, and I think that is such a fantastic, dramatic opening to a book. I love it. The second chapter as a whole I think is really interesting. I understand why a lot of people find it really difficult. It has a lot of characters, and Dickens's description is at its most impenetrable, I would say. He uses a lot of metaphors, and the way in which Dickens describes Mr. Tremolo as being a bit like a piece of furniture within the Veneering's house, and the fact that we have all of these characters, you don't always know who's speaking. I do know that that can be quite tricky, but my personal opinion, which is always my opinion with Dickens, is if you don't understand a sentence, just read the next one, because it doesn't actually matter. This is quite a long book. Dickens likes to use a lot of words. If something dramatic and incredibly important that you really, really shouldn't miss is going to happen, Dickens is going to tell you and you won't miss it, because he likes to be a bit over the top. So although there are a lot of really interesting, complicated subtleties on a kind of line-by-line basis, like, it's not the end of the world if you miss them. If you don't know who all of the characters are from chapter 2, if you can't remember all of their names, that's fine. As long as you remember who Eugene Wrayburn and Mortimer Lightwood are, all of these characters, the people that make up the kind of society backdrop, they are in a way a chorus. They are there to symbolise society more than they are there to be their own individual characters. And many of these characters do crop up again later and take on kind of more individual personalities, but at this level, within this section of the book, they are there mainly to act as a chorus. This chapter serves two purposes really, and one is to reveal more about the Harmon plot, but the other is to show this group in society and their juxtaposition with the characters we see in the first chapter. Because if you think about the descriptions of Lizzie and Gaffer Hexam, they survive by taking things from the river, by taking dead bodies, robbing them and claiming the reward, as is implied later, and also by taking things from the river and using them. So Gaffer Hexam tells Lizzie in the first chapter that she was warmed as a child by fire that came from driftwood that Gaffer had pulled from the river, and everything is very recycled, reused, taking waste and making something of it. And then in the second chapter we have the Veneerings, who are brand new and everything about them is new. That juxtaposition between the Veneerings and the Hexams is really, really important here, I think, because it sets up already this massive divide between classes, which is so important to Our Mutual Friend as a book. I must say, that opening of the second chapter, in which Dickens describes the Veneerings and how brand new they are, is just one of my favourite pieces of writing in all of Dickens. Mr. and Mrs. Veneering were brand new people in a brand new house in a brand new quarter of London. Everything about the Veneerings was spick and span new. All their furniture was new, all their friends were new, all their servants were new, their plate was new, their carriage was new, their harness was new, their horses were new, their pictures were new, they themselves were new, they were as newly married as was lawfully compatible with having a brand new baby. It's just wonderful. And there's also a juxtaposition set up between the gritty reality of the first scene and the complete facade of the second scene, because everything is a pretense. Everyone is pretending that they're really good friends when they don't actually know each other very well. You have Eugene Wrayburn making nursery rhymes out of this man who is coming back to claim his father's property, which is a really dramatic, serious thing, and Eugene Wrayburn dismisses it with a nursery rhyme. Even the sort of reactions and details that are picked out show the juxtaposition between these two levels of society. In the first chapter we have Lizzie's sort of fierce rowing, and we have her real shock at the body, whereas in this chapter the greatest reaction Eugene has is when his gloom deepens to the degree that he trifles quite ferociously with his dessert knife. Another interesting point of comparison between the first chapter and the second is that the second chapter uses present tense, whereas the first chapter uses the past tense. And this is quite interesting. Charles Dickens makes use of the present tense quite a lot in his novels. In Our Mutual Friend, he does use it in quite a number of chapters throughout the book. I think there's about 6 or 7. For a lot of his kind of society chapters, where you get an overview of the members of upper class society, he does use the present tense. I think one of the main reasons why he does this is to kind of accentuate the presentness of the scene, the way he sets up this facade of all these people. There is a lot of social criticism in there, and by writing it in the present tense, Dickens is kind of saying that this is happening now, this is exactly what happens. This is not just part of the story, this is what dinner parties are like for a lot of the upper classes. This is how society operates, and I think that is the significance of the present tense there. So all in all, I know it's quite a complicated chapter, but I hope you will bear with it. Treat the members of society like a chorus who you don't have to necessarily recognise each of them individually, with the exception of Mortimer and Eugene, and treat those characters as symbols of society with a capital S. So moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where chapter 1 and 2 are kind of drawn completely together, and we discover that the body that is being pulled along by Lizzie and Gaffer Hexam's boat in the first chapter is in fact the body of the drowned man, the young Mr. Harmon, who they are discussing in chapter 2. And at the beginning of chapter 3, Eugene Wrayburn and Mortimer Lightwood encounter Charlie Hexam, who is the son of Gaffer Hexam, who is Lizzie's little brother. They are told of the discovery of this body, and they follow Charlie Hexam down through London, moving from their wealthy, bright, sparkling society to a very, very, very different environment, and they go to the police station to identify the body. And they meet a mysterious man called Julius Hanford, and we get this kind of quiet, tender scene at the end of chapter 3 between Lizzie and Charlie Hexam. Then you can see that Lizzie is, although she is Charlie's sister, she also acts as a mother towards him, and there is a lot of discussion between them of that, and also discussion of Charlie's future. Now there are a lot of very interesting things going on in the third chapter, and I think one of the most interesting things is the way it brings together this juxtaposition between one class and the other by bringing Eugene and Mortimer to the scene of Lizzie Hexam, emphasising just how different their lives are. And when we get to the house of the Hexams, the way everything is described is in the language of decaying, which fits with all these themes of kind of death and money and decay and dust, and is at such a contrast again to the brand new Veneerings. And Eugene and Mortimer's characters are really developed quite a lot more in this chapter. Eugene is a barrister, Mortimer is a solicitor, they're both lawyers, and they are both very disillusioned with the world. They have no interest in anything, they are bored, they are placid, they have no energy for life, and they treat everything in life as if it were some kind of joke. So we have them going to this scene, and they see this dead body of this poor man who has drowned, and then as they come out, Eugene turns to Mortimer and says, "Not quite as bad as Lady Tippins." This complete juxtaposition between the seriousness of the situation and these people who are so unprofessional and so unserious, and as well the fact that Mortimer finds it quite entertaining how professional the policeman is, because Mortimer Lightwood is not professional, nor is Eugene Wrayburn. And there is this type of the careless young gentleman that turns up quite a lot in Dickens's novels, especially in his later works. We see it in Sidney Carton in The Tale of Two Cities, we see it in James Harthouse in Hard Times. There are a lot of these characters who are sort of young men who have no energy, these people who have wealth and they don't care about their professions, they do very little work even though they are technically professional young gentlemen, and the complete carelessness of the way they act in comparison to the complete care with which Lizzie talks to Charlie at the end of the chapter, and just how important every decision in life is to them in comparison to Eugene and Mortimer. That's quite an interesting dichotomy that's set up in the book. And of course we also have the appearance of the mysterious Julius Handford, which at once sets us up in the kind of ongoing mysteries of this novel. But he is quite an interesting character, and we have a very, very interesting moment where he sees the dead body and nearly faints, which I greatly approve of as an unofficial scholar of gender in Charles Dickens's work, because in his early books there is a lot of women fainting and men not fainting, and then I like that in Our Mutual Friend there are moments where men almost faint. That makes me very happy. And then there is the conversation between Lizzie and Charlie, which I think is a really interesting, tender moment between them, and quite sad in many ways, because they are very close-knit, and Lizzie and her father are quite close together, but there is a growing disparity, it seems, between Charlie and his father. And we have this conversation about Charlie in school, and there is a great emphasis put on kind of social mobility, on the fact that because Charlie is quite clever and he is being educated, he could go on to be respectable, and he could leave that very unrespectable life of their family completely behind, and that Lizzie really wants that for him, but not for herself. Lizzie Hexam, as I've already said, is a very, very interesting heroine, and there are two really interesting things, I think. One is that Lizzie is not educated and can't read, and that it is her choice not to read. The reason she gives for not wanting to read is not because her father won't allow her, it's because she thinks if she learned how to read, her father would respect her less, and therefore she would have less power over him. The reason why she doesn't read is not because of her father's disapproval so much as to keep her power over him, and that is really, really interesting as well in this chapter, from the way Lizzie Hexam talks to her brother Charlie. Lizzie Hexam has a very Victorian working class voice, and this is very, very important. In a lot of Victorian literature, working class female heroines have a voice that isn't working class and that sounds very, very middle class. So if you think about Sybil in Benjamin Disraeli's Sybil or the Two Nations, that's the case there. And it's very interesting that Lizzie Hexam is very much a working class heroine. Although in Dickens's previous novels we do have quite a lot of heroines who are poor, none of them really seem working class. A lot of them are kind of gentlewomen fallen on hard times, or they are from respectable backgrounds. Their parents were ladies and gentlemen, but they have fallen on hard times. So if you think about Little Dorrit, or if you think about Esther Summerson, these are people who are not very wealthy, but they come from kind of privileged backgrounds, even though they themselves are not privileged, and that is another thing that makes Lizzie Hexam a kind of different heroine for Dickens. In chapter 3, the kind of intonation she uses, the dropping of particular letters in particular words, that kind of thing, it sets her apart from the privileged upper class people and gives her a very distinct, different voice, which emphasises the complete disparity in class between her and Mortimer and Eugene. And this is very important because class is such an important theme in this novel. Talking of class, let's move on to chapter 4. In chapter 4 we are introduced to the Wilfer family. The father, Reginald, his wife and two of their daughters, Bella and Lavinia, and these characters tie into the previous characters we have met in quite an interesting way. Bella, we soon learn, is the young woman who was supposed to be the wife of young Mr. Harmon when he came back from abroad when he inherited his property, but now that young Mr. Harmon has been found drowned, Bella is obviously not. They are from a lower middle class family, and the father, R. Wilfer, he is a clerk in the firm of Chicksey Veneering and Stobbles, which is a nice link back to the second chapter. And I love that Mr. Wilfer works for the Veneerings because it's such a brilliant little connection. And this book is entitled Our Mutual Friend, and although at some point in the book someone is referred to as our mutual friend, and it does refer to a specific mutual friend, it actually in many ways refers to many, many mutual friends, because the whole of this book is full of little connections between a lot of characters. I remember someone once saying to me that every Charles Dickens novel could actually be entitled Great Expectations, because they're all about great expectations, which are mostly dashed. But I also kind of think that you could entitle every Charles Dickens novel Our Mutual Friend, because there are so many mutual friends in Dickens. He always has a lot of characters and they're always tied together in ways you don't quite expect, which I really, really like. And you get a lot of people who know other people who know other people. So anyway, in chapter 4 we are shown the Wilfer family, and we find more out about Bella, who is supposed to be the wife of young Mr. Harmon. And then at the end of the chapter, their new lodger comes to visit and sign his papers, and we are told by the end of the chapter that John Rokesmith is in fact the same man as Julius Handford. Also, just a point on names, apparently Roke is an old word for mystery, so by being called Rokesmith, he's actually called like Mystery Maker. Isn't that really fun? It's also, of course, the Veneerings have a really significant name in the kind of idea of like the veneer and how everything is a pretense. It's really, really interesting that. I love it. One of the things I really like, thinking about how this serialisation these 4 chapters work together is that we get a real kind of cross-section of society where we start off with a very, very impoverished Hexam family, and then we move up to that complete top of upper society, and then we go back again to a kind of meeting between these upper class characters and these very lower working class characters who are really even lower than working class. They're right at the bottom of respectability. And then in chapter 4 we get the Wilfers, who are lower middle class, struggling but respectable. They are a very interesting family to look at in comparison to the Hexams, because the Hexams are completely not respectable. You know, he does make his money by dragging dead bodies out of the Thames. That is not a very respectable living for a Victorian man. And they are very, very poor as well. But it's interesting to note in chapter 3, when Lizzie and Charlie are talking, Lizzie's concerns to raise Charlie in the world are to raise him in respectability, to get him educated, not to make him lots of money. Their concern about raising themselves in society is a concern with respectability. Whereas the Wilfers, who are a respectable lower middle class family, although they are concerned about staying respectable, Bella is so unhappy because they are poor, and she is desperate for money. And especially Bella, who had this glimpse of wealth, she is obsessed with the fact that they're poor, even though they are not as poor as the Hexams, and that is quite interesting, I really think. Now let's talk about Bella herself, because I am a fan of Bella, but I'm also not always a fan of how Dickens presents Bella. And she is at once set up in juxtaposition, I would say, to Lizzie Hexam. The complete selfishness of many of the things she says completely sets her apart from Lizzie, and also the kind of infantilizing language that Dickens uses, which, yes, is not very nice. Bella sits there, this 19-year-old woman with her hair in her mouth, and on one hand maybe it's quite sweet, but also, like, she is described as being like a spoiled child, and it's a bit uncomfortable because she's also described as being very beautiful, so it's a bit like, it's just a bit weird. But anyway, let's leave that alone for a second. We do have this odd contrast within Bella herself of the childish and the woman. She is, on the one hand, very, very spoilt, you know, sat with her hair in her mouth, and she doesn't help with the cooking and she lets other people do it, and she is teasing her sister in a really kind of silly way, and she's kind of messing with her father's hair. But then we have these moments where we see a different side of Bella, and you have to wonder if the childishness is a bit put on. When she signs her name on the kind of lodger agreement between John Rokesmith and her father, it says that her signature is a bold one for a woman's, and that kind of contrasts with her childish imagery. And as well, we have her massively brilliant, wonderful speech about the fact that she was going to get all this money by marrying young Mr. Harmon. And I really love that speech. I'm going to read some of it for you now because I think it's really fascinating. I shouldn't care so much if it wasn't so ridiculous. It was ridiculous enough to have a stranger coming over to marry me, whether he liked it or not. It was ridiculous enough to know what an embarrassing meeting it would be, and how we never could pretend to have an inclination of our own, either of us. It was ridiculous enough to know that I shouldn't like him. How could I like him, left to him in a will like a dozen spoons, with everything cut and dried beforehand like orange chips? Talk of orange flowers, indeed, I declare again, it's a shame. Those ridiculous points would have been smoothed away by the money, for I love money and want it dreadfully. I hate to be poor, and we are degradingly poor, offensively poor, miserably poor, beastly poor. And I love that speech because I think it brings out two very important parts of Bella's character. One, her offence, really, at being left to a man in a will, and how that offends her sense of self and her sense of power, because she is someone that likes power. When Mr. Rokesmith says that he can't provide a reference, she makes a remark about how easy it normally is to provide references just to make him uncomfortable. There is no other reason. And she mocks Lavinia, and she talks about this young man, George Sampson, who liked her, who she was stringing along just for the sake of having power. Bella makes it clear that she likes power, and she knows that being left to someone in a will takes away her power, but she also knows that that marriage would have given her money, which is why she would be willing to go through with it, because she longs for money so much. And this theme of money and how people crave it is really important to our mutual friend, and I think it's fascinating the way it's dealt with by Bella Wilfer in this chapter. It's also fascinating that old Mr. Harmon saw a girl having a tantrum, hitting her father around the head with her bonnet, and decided, that's the girl I want my son to marry. And I never know whether this is supposed to be because old Mr. Harmon liked her spirit, or because old Mr. Harmon hated everyone and wanted his son to be married to a woman who would be really horrible to him. I can't decide which it is, but regardless, I still think it's kind of wonderful. And then, of course, there is the awkwardness between Mr. Rokesmith and Bella Wilfer, and just between Mr. Rokesmith and everyone, because he is very, very awkward. He talks about being in embarrassed circumstances, and again, we have this theme of respectability. The fact that currently Mr. Rokesmith, being unable to provide references, being in London as a stranger, being a very, very awkward person, he lacks respectability. He is a bit suspicious. They think he's a murderer and a thief. And of course at the end of this chapter it is revealed that he is in fact Julius Handford, and this makes him tied up in the Harmon case in another way, and who knows exactly what way it will be. So anyway, general points to discuss. I have very much loved reading the first 4 chapters of Our Mutual Friend. I read them twice, and because I'm not reading all of it, because we're doing the Victorian serialised read-along, I think it's very interesting for me to kind of read it really, really deeply and look at it sentence by sentence. Also for me to hear other people's thoughts and what they're saying on the Goodreads group. Having a think as well about these 4 chapters and how they work together because they were published as one part. There is a lot of drama here that would make you want to read on next month, I think, in my opinion. There are a lot of mysteries set up, and we do get this cross-section of society, and we get to see these very, very different characters interact. And we are introduced in these 4 chapters to the people who I would say are the 4 main characters of the novel. There are a lot of characters in this book, and there are a lot of characters who are very, very important who haven't been introduced yet, but I think the four people who you could claim were the protagonists of this book have been introduced at this point. And as well, the way that Charles Dickens leaves us on this revelation that John Rokesmith is Julius Handford, really building up the mystery and leaving us not exactly on a cliffhanger, but certainly on something that presents a lot of mysteries and draws together many little threads of the first 4 chapters to kind of give a sense of the more mystery going forward. I really like that. So anyway, this has been quite a long video. I have had a lot to say about these 4 chapters. I think I am really, really going to love making these videos. I have so much to say about Dickens, and it's nice to be able to talk about just 4 chapters, just to focus on that very small set, and to be able to talk more about kind of the details of his writing, because I think, as well as loving his plots and his characters and the way all his narratives weave together within his novels, I also really love his writing. I know it's odd and at times can be a bit tricky, but I do love it. I hope everyone else has enjoyed reading the first 4 chapters of Our Mutual Friend. Please let me know what you have thought of them down in the comments on the Goodreads group on Twitter. I know that people have in general enjoyed them but have slightly struggled with the second chapter and have slightly struggled with some of Dickens's language. My advice in general is to just read on. And I think one of the reasons why I love Dickens so much and why I don't think Dickens is hard is because I started reading Dickens when I was 13, when I didn't care enough to want to understand everything, because it was just a good story with good characters, so I wasn't sat there thinking, what does that sentence mean? What does that word mean? I just read. Dickens is tricky to read on a sentence by sentence level, but on a chapter by chapter level he isn't. The second chapter is quite tricky, but when you get into the third chapter you're much more aware of who Eugene and Mortimer are, and the rest of the characters. If they fall behind, that's okay. You will find out who they are later, or you will not if they're not important. Don't get too bogged down if you don't understand a small detail. It is not the end of the world. I don't understand lots of the references or lots of the sentences. There are lots of things that I noticed on this reading that I have never noticed before. You don't have to get everything. It's okay. You will get the important stuff. Read on. So next month in June we will be reading chapters 5, 6 and 7. So chapter 5 is Boffin's Bower, chapter 6 is Cut Adrift, and chapter 7 is Mr. Wegg Looks After Himself. And as you can tell from the title of those chapters, we're going to get introduced to even more characters, which is very, very exciting. So I hope you have enjoyed the first month of the Dickensalong. I hope you will enjoy the second one as well. Please let me know all your Our Mutual Friends thoughts down below in the comments and on the Goodreads group. If you did not join in with the Dickensalong this month but you would like to going forward, then of course you can catch up. There are only 4 chapters to read on top of June's 3 chapters, so please do join in and join the Goodreads group if you would like. I hope you have enjoyed this very, very long rambly video. I have so much to say about this book because I love it so much that even 4 chapters will provide me with a lot of footage. I don't know how long this video will be when I cut it, but I've been filming for about an hour and a half. Oh dear. But anyway, I'll be back soon with another video. In the meantime, happy reading and happy Dickensalong.